Jesus did something extraordinary. Alex O'Connor, ladies and gentlemen, on his channel, More Alex O'Connor. Always hit the like button, subscribe to Alex, and subscribe to us. Please be here as part of our reaction family. I will say this. These titles are obviously going to trigger fundamentalists, if I could use the term, on either side. Well, maybe not either side. Maybe some of the more very staunch atheists will not like these kinds of titles. And truth be told, Jesus was probably, if you grant the historical Jesus, as many of the academics I talk to do, was probably a charismatic character, charismatic cult leader for his particular group. And clearly they saw him as someone very beloved, someone important in their life. So many people could do extraordinary things. Just before we begin this video, many people can do things that make them extraordinary from the average Joe. And you would imagine that's why they are seen as the central leader of the particular movement. Jesus being one, Muhammad being for Islam. Take Mormonism with Joseph Smith and various figures. These people are pretty significant. That does not mean they walked on water. That does not mean they committed actual miracles and such. But they did things that made them stand out. Now, let's see what Alex says as we venture into this reaction. And again, like the video and comment down below your thoughts. Thank you so much for being part of the family. Let's see what happens.
For me, the most troublesome part of Christianity, for its truth, for me personally, is its clinging on to the Old Testament, is the fact that Jesus is...
So he's already starting up, just so everyone knows, with that title that'll get some people worked up. He's saying one of the problems is it clings to the Old Testament. That they're already clinging to the Old Testament. So he's already starting with a problem, ladies and gentlemen.
It is portrayed as the fulfillment of the Jewish scripture. And so you cannot let go of this Yahweh figure in the Old Testament who's really troublesome.
And that's why they have to have him in Bethlehem to connect him to David and things like that. And so actually, because when you look at the historicity of Jesus, then it starts to I mean, there was clearly a guy called Jesus, but he wasn't born in Bethlehem. There wasn't a census. Herod was dead by this point.
That is the consensus view, that there was a guy. And there are some who doubt it, but that is the consensus.
It seems to me that they wanted him in Bethlehem to connect him to the Old Testament. And does that matter? I mean, because there was a Jesus guy.
Yeah.
He said some stuff. Clearly he said something so strong that people for the next 2,000 years have reacted, and indeed in the first 50 years they reacted very strongly to it. So there must be. That's one of the great interesting things about religion, isn't it?
I mean, think about the millions of Mormons, right? The millions of Mormons that are practicing Mormonism today. Joseph Smith said some significant things to his earliest people, but the snowball effect takes place where they're not really connected necessarily to the original guy. They're connected to the ideas or some of the things that were added to the guy's, vision of who he was and the ideas of who he was. The Gospels have so much legend and mythology, so much put in the mouth of Jesus that likely was not Jesus saying it, that, you're dealing with as Richard Miller might call it in his book, you're dealing with a meme or an archetype. Jesus becomes a mold for the philosophy of your school of thought, and he becomes larger than life, than far more than what he actually was in real life.
By Jesus created a religion that lasted and spread around the world so quickly.
Yeah, Jesus did something extraordinary, and you're right to say that basically nobody doubts he existed. There are some Jesus mythicists who think that he didn't exist. But yeah, he existed. It's also quite well established that he was crucified, which is quite an extraordinary fact, because whatever he was saying annoyed people enough that they put him to death in the most sort of gory way a person can imagine.
So it sounds, look, that is the consensus view. I am open, just being honest. I am open to, questioning these ideas. While I definitely think that what Alex says makes a bunch of sense, and that's a path I go down in my mind, there are another path. They would never invent an embarrassing situation of their guy being crucified. Have you ever read about Attis, the Attis cult? They literally invented a story about the character Attis, who castrated himself in front of a tree, bled out to death, and he is their central figure. and they worship him, and they believed in him. And he was so significant that Claudius in the 50s instructed a Roman-wide celebration of Attis. The guy cut his junk off and bled to death. Embarrassing? They made it up, though. So I just don't... Look, I get that scholars like to say this is historical fact, and it may be, but it may not be. Just being real with you, it may not be. And it's hard for me when I know that the school of thought has come out of Christianity in the academic circles for so long that I wish there were more mythicists, just saying, because I don't think we should be overly certain about everything that we are reading.
And it's unlikely to be the kind of thing that would have just been like made up out of the blue as well, because
that's why I brought Attis to the picture, because why would they make up Attis, right? Now, it is probably unlikely. I tend to agree that Jews were being crucified. Obviously, Josephus talks about this. Philo talks about this. Rome crucified tons of Jews. Tons of Jews. Insurrections happen all the time. They weren't playing games. And what are the odds that some charismatic figure got himself killed? Like John the Baptist was killed by Herod Antipas. I believe it was Antipas or Herod the Great. Can't remember which Herod at the time off the top of my head. But like, it's not unlikely that a Jew got himself killed.
Because like God becoming a man is already troublesome enough for many people, but for him to be crucified, like now we see the cross as a really beautiful and important symbol. People wear it around their necks, but at the time, I mean, this is an instrument of torture. One of the
for slaves often as well.
Possibly the earliest depiction of Jesus that we have in art. I think it's tied for there's the so-called magical gemstone in the British Library, but tied for the earliest depiction of Jesus anywhere, any image of Jesus, is a bit of graffiti. It's a graffito which was etched into the wall of the Palatine Hill in Rome.
Yeah.
And I think it dates from like, I want to say like the 2nd or 3rd century.
Okay.
Right. And it's a stick figure of a man with a donkey's head being crucified and another man worshipping him. And it writes out in Greek, Alexamenos worships his God, or Alexamenos worships God.
And that has deep roots. The donkey god. There's a book by M. David Litwell. I'm trying to see if I could see it back here. But there's a book back here called The Evil Creator, where he goes into this actual interesting propaganda that was going on against Jews. And Yahweh, they saw as similar to the god Set in Egypt. And Set, of course, had this kind of jackal donkey head. So there's this way in which the ass represented the deity, this desert deity of death and such. And they had Yahweh as a mockery of that. Well, here's Jesus having the face of a donkey. And some have interpreted this to be that continuation of that mockery of Yahweh.
So somebody's making fun of this guy called Alexamenos for worshipping this donkey-headed god who gets crucified. Given that people used to mock Yahweh as a donkey-headed deity, that's the whole thing. And the fact that this man's on a cross, it's quite clearly Jesus being depicted. Somebody's worshipping a god who's crucified.
Yeah.
It's definitely a Christian image. But the very earliest depiction that we have is somebody making fun of Alexamenos because he's worshipping this crucified man.
Yeah.
So the story's quite extraordinary, right? The question is what actually happened.
Well, the Christians also mocked the Greek myths, and it wasn't just Christians. There were other philosopher types who mocked the stories of the Greeks. I mean, Heraclitus, for example, mocks the Dionysians, the Dionysian and Orphic cults, their mysteries. It was not uncommon for them to mock the sacred stories of some of these figures. What if the gospel is a sacred story that was invented? And they're just mocking the depiction that is portrayed there within the story, like someone would mock Attis castrating himself. Someone probably came along and thought, this is so stupid. He cuts his you-know-what off and his you-know-what off, all of it, and bleeds to death in front of a tree. How dumb. Well, Christians mocked the Greek myths. And they mocked Zeus for sleeping with women, forcing himself upon them. Crazy stuff that I'm not going to say YouTube would ding me for. But, there was a lot of immoral behaviors and unethical things that they found within the Greek myths and silly stuff. They mocked them for it. This is exactly what you get with the critics of Christianity, Celsus or Celsus, if you want to call him Celsus. Or you might even have this with Julian the Apostate and others who really critique Christianity and its claims. So let's continue and see what happens. But I just don't rule out that option.
And an interesting thing about biographies, and the Gospels are biographies, basically.
Matthew's very much a biography. They all write in biographic terms, but it would be maybe a tad bit more mythic origins. Some of them are seeming to be origin myths. Virgil's Aeneid seems to be in competition with the book of Acts. So Luke Acts, whoever wrote Luke likely wrote Acts, and there's this competition going on between this literature, and Virgil's an origin myth, not a history. So there is a biographic sense to it, but a lot of scholars question categorizing it strictly in biography, because you don't always have cradle to grave. Some of the things that they do not always line up with what biographies do at all. So there's putting it in a strict single genre is typically, questionable.
With, I think, some mythical elements as well. In particular, the birth narratives. Nobody really would have known who Jesus was. If we are to believe these stories, he's born of a virgin, it's all prophesied, and so of course people would know. But I think historically, nothing really happened with Jesus until he was in his 30s. So what is it that ancient biographers do with people like Alexander the Great? They construct these birth narratives, which are not historical, are not even really meant to be historical.
No, although they've been interpreted by people later on as historical.
Exactly. And so I think what's going on is, so Mark's gospel, our earliest gospel.
But that's kind of the point about this whole, what is history and what is fact and what isn't. Later believers may be reading a sacred story and applying it and thinking it is historical. How do we know what is really historical or not in the Gospels?
Has no birth narrative. And when Matthew and Luke come to write their Gospels, they think this is really important. We should have some kind of birth narrative. Luke's is the most elaborate. Begins with the pregnancy of Elizabeth with John the Baptist. But, you were right. There's this story in the birth narratives you'll have seen in the Nativity. It gets a bit confusing because, there's Bethlehem, but then Jesus is also from Nazareth and Galilee. And don't they go to Egypt at one point? It's all a bit confusing. And it's because they're trying to fulfill these prophecies. So there's a prophecy in Hosea which says, out of Egypt I shall call my son, where God is clearly talking about Israel coming out of the land of Egypt. But this prophecy, out of Egypt I shall call my son, Matthew wanted to take this, or Luke wanted to take this and make it about Jesus. And so you get this story of the flight to Egypt, where Herod hears that the king of the Jews has been born, and he's like, we must kill all of the infants in the land. And so Joseph,
I think that's Matthew, but
is warned in a dream, and they run away to Egypt.
They may have it in both.
Back again, the Gospels can say, so fulfills prophecy, out of Egypt I shall call my son. So maybe that did actually happen, but it's unlikely. Matthew at one point also quotes a prophecy that doesn't exist.
But does this matter? I mean, what this boils down to, that there was a historical Jesus, most likely. He wasn't necessarily the figure portrayed for the reasons you've just been describing, but he did go on to change the world fundamentally because people believed in whatever he was saying.
What did he say? Did he say he was going to rise from the dead? Was it just simply the teachings that, the Sermon on the Mount that got them to see it this way? Interpretation can shift and change over time.
The truth of what he was matter.
It does to Christians, because the big Christian claim is a physical one, which is that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's really important. Paul famously writes in 1 Corinthians, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you're still in your sins, right? That is what allows for salvation.
And it's fundamentally, in a rational world, it's fundamentally implausible.
I think so. Resurrections seem pretty implausible, right? But with God, anything's possible, right? So it's not outside of the realm of possibility for me to imagine that if there is a God, he could do something like that. The issue is that for Christians, this is really important. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then it is all meaningless. Whereas if you're someone who just thinks Jesus had this really important message, even if you accept the mythicism around his birth and his death, you can still think that he was really important and that something really weird happened that made people found this religion around.
Which you would think. You would believe this.
I think so, yeah. To the extent that even in early Christianity, I'm a big fan of looking into the alternate, expanded edition, director's cut of the Gospels, the Gnostic.
Or the
apocryphal Gospels, I should say, because they're not all Gnostic, but these weird other gospels that aren't part of the canon, mostly later. So the four gospels in the Bible are probably our earliest, right? And we have these later texts, which people get confused when I discuss.
Maybe. Just to comment on that, Elaine Pagels thinks that the Gospel of Mary is being attacked by the Gospel of Luke, which means that gospel exists somewhere around there. She also thinks that the Gospel of Thomas might be interacting or arguing against, the Gospel of John is arguing against the Gospel of Thomas, which means the Gospel of Thomas would be written and existing around the time of the Gospel of John. So it'd be one of our earliest. Clearly the four are some of our earliest, but to say that they are the earliest is definitely, we don't know.
Because I think that they're true or trustworthy. Like, they're not, but they do give us an insight into what people believed, because this was their text. This is what they thought. And a lot of these like gospels are either sort of like unconcerned with the resurrection, or think that it kind of doesn't matter. Like the Gospel of Thomas is a famous one. It's a list of sayings, doesn't mention the resurrection.
Does it mention the afterlife? Because that seems to be another critical part of this in religion. We had David Baddiel on this program talking about he's an atheist, but he understands why people believe in God. Yeah. And his argument is they believe in God because they need to believe there's something more after they die. And that's an argument for why Christianity is so successful, because it says to a bunch of downtrodden people, your life might be now, but it's going to be great thereafter.
I think that's a little bit unfair, because it's this sort of slave morality idea that like you take, it's the Nietzschean view that you...
Yeah, but that's... Slavery is literally the very fabric of the theology of the New Testament. I mean, you're a slave of God. Israel was a slave of God. You know, we need to be bondservants, slaves of Christ. His yoke is light, and it is slave language. It is clearly slave language throughout the New Testament. Now, why would this be popular maybe among more rich people? Is they also suffer. People have hard times. Life is tough. So I could see why a philosophy that teaches stuff about immortality and all that kind of stuff, especially within the Greco-Roman context where immortality was on every street corner from every mystery cult, would be popular.
Take something which people can't help, which is their downtrodden status. They're poor. They don't have any power. They're essentially immiserated. And because they can't help being those things, they decide to invent like a system of virtue around them. So suddenly it's good to be, the whole Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It's very sort of, like it's designed to make you feel
it's
good.
Canny, it's mass media, it's approaching it's mass media.
But the thing is, this is clearly not just something which consoles people who are poor and humble. This is clearly something which people who are powerful and rich and well off discover when they have their come to Jesus moment and realize that it's all meaningless, right? And so it's not, I don't think it's as simple as like this was just invented to console people who are downtrodden, because then why would it also be so effective at transforming the lives of people whose lives are ostensibly going quite well? Powerful rulers convert to Christianity. Constantine converting to Christianity set the Roman Empire.
Well, that's centuries later. But yeah, I do think even early on, you're probably going to get some rich people involved. Remember now, there's 4 gospels, so not every text is speaking to every person. And people today do this. How many rich Christians are there in the world? How many Christians do you know that have like tons and tons of money, but they don't let the whole sell everything you have and come follow me bother them? Again, I think fundamentally the religion does seem to target more of the downtrodden and such. But, maybe not every bit of it. Maybe not every single spot. Blessed are the poor. And then what does Matthew do? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Not poor as in money, poor in spirit. Oh, okay, you can be rich then. So there's these funny things happening within the New Testament that targets both groups.
Well, the genius that it does both is, that's the genius of Christianity. If you were to look at it from a PR campaign,
exactly,
it has a huge base.
But if it were true, that's what you'd expect. So the fact that you can describe it as, it brings comfort to people, and there's this implication that, well, that explains why it exists. It's not true. It's just that it brings comfort to people. Well, if it were true, you would expect it to succeed basically any way you find it, and it does. Like anybody in any position in their life can find something in Christianity to like, right? And so I do think
if it were true, that's an odd statement by Alex. If it were true, it'd be successful for almost anybody in any place you find. Mormonism, for example, has had some very racist roots, not only toward natives, but also toward black people. And there's all sorts of stuff you could find in the histories how that changed. They changed it to hit those audiences, to target people beyond particular white Americans. The fact that a religion will adapt and accommodate the environment, the people groups that they're in, does not anyway have bearing on their truth. In fact, I could even imagine that a god, we could pick up an evil god, we could talk about a god that has such a narrow outlook that only a few people on earth figure out the truth about it and everyone else is wrong. I don't think it has any bearing on what is true, is all I'm saying. I think the fact is that it did a good job of mutating in an evolutionary fashion to its environment, to its constituents and such, very well, to the point where when Christianity hits the East, you get this Eastern philosophy Christianity that starts to happen, right? And various forms of Christianity. Christianity in Alexandria, Egypt, look very different from Christianity in Rome and Christianity in the East. This is just how it works. It does a really good job of mutating.
It's a little bit simplistic when people say, religion just gives you consolation, especially because so much of religion is not just about the afterlife. The afterlife's a really important concept, but it's not like Christians are thinking about it day in and day out. They're thinking about the proper way to orient themselves.
And it's not there in Judaism either, is it?
That's true. Yeah, there's much less of a conception of the afterlife. And it's interesting how that evolves over time in the Bible as well, because the Bible is also this written history. If you can work out roughly which texts are older and which ones are newer, you can track the way that beliefs shift. Like the existence of heaven and hell, the existence of Satan, for example, who begins as this character in the Old Testament, the Satan, the accuser, and he's part of God's divine council. Yeah. And he's advising God and bartering with God, to sort of later become this embodied being who tempts Jesus in the desert to, in Christian history and mythology, to become the ruler of hell. It's a trajectory that you can track. But I think what's really important is that most of the ideas that you associate with Christianity, like the afterlife and heaven and this kind of stuff, are essentially not biblical. Yeah. That is, at the very least, the way that they're characterized.
Even with Mary, right? We talked about this on my big channel, MythVision podcast. I did an episode recently, I believe it was the Proto-Evangelium of James, where Mary is perpetually seen as a virgin, and that dominates the theology. But this is a non-canonical text that ended up ruling the thought of Christianity for even today. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex O'Connor. I hope you don't mind my constructive criticism or my thoughts there on why this is such a mess and why it's not so simple and easy to really just explain things in one direction. There's a lot more to it, I think, and a lot more to freedom and fun and enjoying alternative views to consider when we're talking about Bible, when we're talking about New Testament and its origins and development and all these things. I love this stuff, and I hope you do too. Be sure to subscribe to our React channel. If you hit the bell and then check all, so you'll see subscribe, click it, hit the bell. If you don't hit the bell and check all, you won't get notified every time we do a reaction. Please do that. Like the video, comment down below your favorite part. I want your thoughts about this. Until next time, see you then.